additional funds to support it. There is the idea that Montana and Washington have just approved in the last year, which is license plates that are California State Park license plates with all of the money going to capital improvements, not to other aspects. A surcharge for a small surcharge on outdoor recreation equipment and sporting goods sales in the state. Funds go only to operation and maintenance or capital improvements for California State Parks and for California Fish and Game, the folks who provide the resource base that Californians use. I was a concessionaire for National Park Service for 25 years. I think the toughest nut to crack is going to be the capital improvements. How do we get back on this deferred maintenance issue? Because as a concessionaire, I would not want to join in a contract where the water system was failing and I had unlimited knowledge about what my future costs were going to be operating that particular park because of capital structure problems. So those were my suggestions, and I thank you for your attention.
Professor, thank you for that. Just for definitional purposes, what constitutes a group, as you were describing, group spending by group?
The average group is 3.7 persons. That's who visits the park, and a group could that's one group visiting one time, so they could visit multiple times in 1 year.
But we could take 65 million divided by 3.7 and multiply it by 211, and that would be your overall economic impact from state park visitorship?
It's problematic from an economic impact perspective. I do a number of these studies.
Yeah.
If you're looking at the state, let's take that just as an example. Non-residents, you're talking about new money that comes into the system. So if you look at only the state, you would only be able to count non-resident spending. But when we look at local communities, that's new money coming into those local communities. What they spent at home really doesn't affect the balance here. That's not new money. That's just spent in their local community. So the key factors, if you look at the study area being the state, non-residents, if you look at the study area being local communities, it's non-residents to those local communities.
So your supposition is if someone locally didn't spend it on going to their state park, they'd spend it on some other discretionary purpose in the community,
exactly.
or at least in the state.
Exactly. That's the whole basis of most economic analysis, is that it's new money brought into the system.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Mr. Hueso.
Thank you. Does that work? I've always argued that state parks are benefit in so many different ways. You talked about the environmental benefit of preserving resources. You talked about the economic benefit. What you didn't cover was in how many instances in our state does a state park bring a positive property value to the adjacent property owner? In some instances, state parks are preserved as open space, and if that's in front of a beach or in front of a very significant environmental resource, not having development around somebody's property may confer a economic benefit. Wouldn't you agree?
Absolutely. The best example of that are community parks, where the housing value around community parks increases the closer you get to the park.
And have we figured that into the formula as well?
No, that has not been discussed.
In coming up with a solution, I mean, we talked about how closure may have a negative impact. We talked about how closure may interfere with our ability to maintain the environmental resources. So if we have something that we need to put money into to maintain or protect, we need money for that. And coming up with a solution, I think we have to really look at all the benefits that state parks confer, so we can come up with the best possible solution. When I heard that that 75% of our state parks budget came from Hearst Castle. It kind of dismisses the notion that parks cannot somehow pay for themselves, because this one more than pays for itself. And in addition to having that revenue, they have a foundation that they established that helps raise money for preservation, protection, and it's an endowment of sorts. Have we looked at finding ways to make parks that are in attractive locations be more profitable?
It's a very good question. I think there's clearly opportunities for that. As the area that national parks have really addressed that issue is getting the private sector to help fund historic preservation. So these buildings may be old and crumbling. They're very important. And, Cavallo Point in San Francisco area, where they had private funders come in, build a conference, renovate, very controlled, renovate historic structures with private funds. They operate that as an inn, profit-making inn, and a significant share of the revenue, the gross receipts, goes to the Park Service in that case. So that's one instance where we would possibly be able to captivate two particular vexing problems. One is, how do you deal with crumbling historical resources that need maintenance, and how do we get more visitors and revenue into the park?
How about visitor accommodations?
That is a tricky wicket. If we look at the National Park Service, they have a clear direction, which is moving all of those outside of parks and not approving any new lodging accommodations inside parks, not building new ones. Their thinking is that we have limited open space and recreation opportunities. Why are we filling them up with commercial ventures?
And I agree with that. But if our choices are to close them and to keep them open, we have to at least look where they make sense. For example, if you look at California, we have a very large amount of coastline that's under the state parks, yet there's no visitor accommodations there. And when I served on the Coastal Commission, it was really hard to find anyone developing low-cost visitor accommodations. And if we can provide that too, I mean, we created a policy, the Coastal Act, that says low-cost visitor accommodations is something that's extremely desirable and very important to us, yet we don't really have the mechanism that's accomplishing that. It's not being done by the private sector because they claim they can't do it feasibly. The cost of the land and the coastline is extremely expensive, and yet we own it through our state parks. We can find ways, and I know of some that were contemplated in San Diego, and then there was a pushback. But if we can create low-cost visitor accommodations in areas that normally have very high-cost visitor accommodations, and we can place them in the coastline, and if we can achieve that through a public-private partnership, if possible, I think that'll be a great source of revenue for our state park system in the future, and it would revive these parks that currently are not being visited. Wouldn't you agree?
There's a tremendous latent demand for that already, so I would agree with you.
Thank you.
Ms. Olson.
Thank you. I'll be quick. You mentioned that, and I think it's really important for us to be mindful of this, and I'm wondering if you know what the threshold is, but that when entrance fees or other fees go up, visitation goes down. And so as we talked about earlier, we're very interested in empirical data. So do you have any statistics to back that up or to inform us as to what that threshold is or what a ratio is once we get too high?
I wish I did, but I can point to when park entrance fees were eliminated, and those were the boom days. Those were our highest, by far the highest visitation we had in the state. Entrance fees could go up $5 per day for the Sunset Magazine crowd, and it would make absolutely no difference at all. At San Francisco State, we've looked at a lot of different studies where we look at some of our less fortunate citizens, and the parks have a real challenge getting those kinds of people into parks in the first place, Parks for All movement, and adding additional fees, even the perception of the cost going up, does have an impact.
Okay. If you do run across any studies, or even that former one that you ran across where the visitation went up when fees were eliminated, I'd be very interested in that. Thank you.
Thank you. This may have been asked, so I apologize if it was, but the idea of peak demand pricing for those fees, so that it's not just a question of you raise fees or lower fees, but everybody knows that you're going to be oversubscribed on July 4th and Memorial Day and all these other times. What about some strategic fee increases where you know you're not going to diminish visitation? All you will do is raise revenue. Have they looked at that, to your knowledge?
I don't believe so. We certainly have lots of examples from airlines to hotels that are all doing demand pricing, and so that's
Right.
not a new concept. It brings up the question of accessibility and equal access. That would be the only concern. Otherwise, there's certainly demand for it. There's certainly, willingness to pay, but it's an equal access issue.
Great. Any other questions then for the professor? We will thank you very much for your testimony and your answers. And next is Elizabeth Goldstein, the Executive Director of the California State Parks Foundation. Welcome, Elizabeth.
Good morning. Are we still in morning? Yes, just barely. Thank you very much, Assemblymember Huffman, and at the moment in absentia, Assemblymember Dickinson, for holding this important hearing today. I'm Elizabeth Goldstein, the president of the California State Parks Foundation, an independent nonprofit organization with 120,000 members statewide. Our mission is to protect, enhance, and advocate for California's state parks, a mission that has been important for our 42-year history, but seems even more critical today. And I am joined by many colleagues from many different kinds of organizations today, and I just wanted to let you know that the people that you see in this room are joined by people who are overflowing into the hall, who are sincerely dedicated to our state park system. We wholeheartedly agree with the premise of this hearing. Closing parks is bad for California and will end up costing the state in ways that have not been analyzed, understood, or factored into the budget-making process. In fact, today we launched our Closing Parks is Bad for Business campaign that is moving to highlight the impacts that these closures will have for the business community. The $22 million that has been cut from the department's budget clearly strikes a blow to the California state park system. No one should expect that our state park system can continue to exist as it does today, let alone survive or strive for improvements or excellence, if the state continues to defund the agency responsible for core maintenance, resource protection, and operations in our parks. But state parks in California belong to the people of California and is bigger than and supported by many partners than simply the Department of Parks and Recreation. In this moment, we are currently focusing our efforts in those directions, particularly in identifying even more ways we can provide support and assistance to local partners that will operate parks on behalf of all Californians. You're about to hear from a wide variety of groups, many of whom have been we've been working with since the closure list came out in May. They are striving to put smart, thoughtful proposals before the state. However, just about every one of them will also articulate the immense challenges that they are facing in doing so. I want to leave you with CSPF's thoughts about what the legislature should be doing to help save our state parks. First, do no more harm. The state park system cannot afford additional budget cuts, which may be portended by the economic recovery or lack thereof. Further cuts or threats of cuts to the department will only exacerbate the barriers that currently exist right now to enacting partnerships for the crisis at hand. Navigating the often incomplete and sometimes contradictory information about what it takes and costs to operate a park on the closure list, minimum standards that will be required to be met in closed parks, services that the state may continue to provide, and more is in itself an incredibly frustrating barrier facing many potential partners today and would be worse if additional cuts were enacted. Second, do not let good deeds get punished. There are already aggressive efforts underway to bring additional philanthropic funding and contributions to the state park system. However, if the philanthropic community sees the legislature is looking for a way to substitute private money for key public responsibilities, or that their contributions are expected to be open-ended, that philanthropic support will evaporate. Further reductions of the general fund allocation to the state park system, or a failure to add more public funding for parks when the economy rebounds, will be perceived as punishment for good deeds that must be avoided at all cost. Third, support and be part of credible local efforts to keep parks open. I am optimistic that the passage of AB 42 and the broad bipartisan support it has received reflects an acceptance of this suggestion. But I've operated state and local park systems myself, and I know that moving towards new models for operating parks becomes more challenging when the rubber hits the road. CSPF is actively working to develop programs to support organizations that are stepping up to the challenge of keeping parks open. We are looking to providing matching and challenge grants for operational needs, as well as expertise through a library of consultants to organizations. But your active help and the resources of your legislative offices and community connections will also be needed to bring your community together to make a local solution really work. Finally, support the efforts to identify appropriate, mission-centric ways to increase or establish revenues in parks. This is not a call for turning our parks into something that they are not. We at CSPF oppose efforts that would sell state parks, give naming rights for parks, or exploit our parks and park visitors for inappropriate commercial goals. On behalf of our members, we will fight efforts to move in the wrong direction. But there is a right direction that must be explored. That direction could contemplate new amenities in state parks, new services, new features that would bring new park visitors and entice current visitors to pay something extra. We are currently tackling the biggest challenges that we have faced in the California state park system in their 100-year history. I have no doubt that we can overcome these challenges, but only if we all see ourselves as vital partners in the effort. We all have particular roles to play, and I do hope that the legislature will work in the ways I've outlined today. For we are the generation that has a greater burden than any before us to give this state park system back better than we found it. For the opposite is too awful to contemplate. Thank you for your time and attention today.
Thank you, Ms. Goldstein. I'd like to ask you one question before we let you go. So thank you for your testimony. I appreciate very much the laying out of specific principles and recommendations for us. That's always helpful. You have a can-do approach to this. You think there is a way to get more creative. You mentioned amenities and other things. Do you believe we can find something approaching $22 million in ongoing savings while still keeping a vibrant world-class state park system going?
I believe that to close the budget gap, which I think is not just $22 million, but a significant amount
Deferred
of money
maintenance
beyond that,
else, yeah.
that we are ultimately going to have to find public as well as private tools to do this. I have enormous confidence that the philanthropic community is game to step up. I have enormous confidence in my colleagues who are in this room and those who are not in it, that we will find creative ways to keep parks open in the real sense, in the sense that there will be visitor services to greet them, not just an open gate. I have enormous confidence that we can and must find a dedicated solution to public funding these state parks in the long term as well. And I think that all of these things, park systems have an incredibly diversified revenue sources, and all of them can be better than they are currently. And they are all interdependent. And to understand those complexities and to respond to those complexities, you really need to think about these things one at a time. But I do believe that there are enormous opportunities to increase revenues, find new philanthropic partners, find new operating models that all will help. None of them will eliminate the problem that the system is confronting at the moment without an additional public funding source.
Right. So can you imagine a solution to the immediate challenge that we have where we make some changes? We certainly can lock in some ongoing savings, but maybe also some temporary savings that get us through the next few years while endeavoring to have a process that looks at the longer term and the bigger picture. Is that sort of what you have in mind?
It is sort of what we have in mind. I mean, I think that we at CSPF are girding ourselves to what seems inevitable at this point, which is whether 70 parks or 69 or 71 are on that list, that we will collectively as a community be able to step up and find solutions to a third to half maybe of those parks if we're wildly optimistic. But I don't want to leave this podium with anyone believing that a park closure is, and I'm not talking about parks that can get reopened with these operating agreements or with concessionaires or something else, but the remaining parks that indeed are going to close. They are not going to be open to the public in any sense of the way that people anticipate the use of parks now. There are not going to be restrooms. There are not going to be lifeguards. There's not going to be natural resource protection or cultural resource protection in any manner, shape, or form in the way that we anticipate. These are places where marijuana is going to get grown. These are places where vandalism is going to happen and where people are going to get hurt if they venture in without assistance. And so to sort of we've gotten very creative with the semantics today, but I think that we have to recognize that the damage that is going to come to these places that are on the closure list and do not have a partner stepping up is profound and will make it much harder for you in the long term to reopen them when resources become more available. So I'm not sure I'm answering your question.
Well, no, I think you did. One last question. Are you familiar with the experience that Minnesota had
Absolutely.
a few months back? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. They actually closed. They were failing, as my understanding of the circumstances that led to this was they were actually failing to come to a budget agreement, and so the government shut down in Minnesota for a period. I can't remember exactly how long it was, but in that short time, the parks that were closed experienced enormous vandalism, and there was a significant loss of buildings from vandalism and special equipment that was destroyed and needed to be replaced just in a very short period of time. And there was one very notable example where a group of young people who apparently didn't have something better to do that weekend went in and did such a substantial amount of damage that the park system is still currently recovering from it. And that was just, those parks were closed for, I think, maximum a couple of weeks. But they were also closed over 4th of July weekend. And I think that's an example of what we're going to be seeing all over the state of California. And just one more point, and I know you're anxious to get on to other speakers, but I want to emphasize something that Bill Herms mentioned, and that is that if your park is not on the closure list, do not think you are exempt.
Right.
The cutbacks in service that are going to happen all over and already are happening. And I'll just give you one example that I know off the top of my head. The brand new Baldwin Hills Visitor Center, which is an astonishing piece of architecture and interpretation, is now open 2 days a week in one of the poorest areas of Los Angeles. And that is just one example of many that we have heard. So that park is not on the closure list. That's on the open list. And so I think that we're going to see less lifeguards, even in parks that are open. We're going to see less maintenance of restrooms. We're going to see less natural resources. I mean, it's going to go on and on. So even if your park has escaped the closure list, I urge you to think that you are a threat as well.
Thank you for that. All right, thank you, Elizabeth Goldstein. We'll ask next a panel of speakers to come forward and sit around the table. These are local and regional perspectives on the park closure issue and hopefully also some creative thinking about avoiding park closures. Welcome. Carol Hart, do you want to begin from Sonoma County?
Yes, thanks very much, Assemblymember Huffman, Assemblymember Dickinson. Thank you so much for having us here today, and especially for taking up this critical issue of the impact of state park closures. I'm speaking today as chair of the State Park Commission and also on behalf of the newly formed Sonoma County Parks Alliance. It's a group made up of representatives from state and regional parks, as well as those nonprofits in Sonoma County who are involved in park access and preservation. We've been able to hire 2 staff people, including the former state park superintendent for the region, Dave Gould, who's here today. And I believe that there are also other members of the Alliance, I know there are, that are going to come here and speak with you today as part of public comment. In addition to my role as the chair of the State Parks Commission, a role which I've served for a number of years, I've been on the commission since 2000, I'm also the director of Sonoma County Regional Parks. And therefore, I feel particularly qualified to speak today about the impact of state park closures in my county, Sonoma County, which, by the way, Sugarloaf State Park is in Sonoma County. It's on your list there. Just wanted to clarify that. And in fact, in Sonoma, we've been notified of the state's intention to close 5 of our state parks, including Annandale, Sugarloaf Ridge, Austin Creek, Petaluma Adobe, and Jack London state parks. As you can imagine, should these closures go forward as threatened, the impact on our local economy, environment, and the health and well-being of our residents will be seriously impacted. As a county that voted for Prop 21 by a significant majority, this is a real blow. From my perspective, the state park closures will result in a budgetary hit far beyond the savings that will be gained from the proposed cuts. As those who've spoken before me have clearly laid out, the cost will be far in excess of any savings. There's going to be lawsuits, property damage within and outside of the parks, loss of outside funding sources, loss of tourism dollars, health and well-being declines, local economic impacts, and deterioration of assets that the public has paid billions of dollars to preserve, and that's even just in the last few years. Obviously, the state is in a financial crisis, and this crisis affects all aspects of state government, social welfare, criminal justice, education, and we appreciate that. And in fact, there's much to be learned from the state's response to the federal requirements to reduce prison overcrowding when pressed new models developed. The consensus is that properly funded realignment of the criminal justice system will provide for more efficient operation while providing increased savings for the state over time. I would propose that there is potential for similar savings with a new approach to the operation of state parks that includes a much stronger component and role for county-level management. Let me give you some examples of what I mean. Keeping in mind that there are a number of ongoing negotiations and none of which what I'm describing here have been decided. Let's take the case of Annandale State Park, 5,000 acres surrounded by the city of Santa Rosa. Formerly a cattle ranch, Annandale is treasured and heavily used by the local community. It's adjacent to a county regional park within my department, and that likewise adjoins a city park. The boundaries to Annandale are numerous. Well, the boundary is one, but the entry points are numerous, and the least used is along State Park Road, at the end of which is the pay lot. There's several points that invite free parking. There's trailheads and park signage. The result is that Annandale is almost fully supported by the state's general fund and produces virtually no income for state parks. The result, Annandale is slated for closure. What are some of the solutions for this park? First, we have a strong regional parks department and strong support for parks in the county. Second, there are a number of nonprofits anxious to help with the park operation. Third, there's the political will to keep Annandale open at the local level. Therefore, a solution to Annandale's operating losses is likely a combination of state park and regional park operations with nonprofit support. Rather than attempting to close this park, which in addition to subjecting state parks to lawsuits from its violation of Land and Water Fund commitments, as is noted, Annandale is a Land and Water Conservation Fund beneficiary, it'll also impact county public safety resources, and you're going to hear about that later from our county sheriff, Freitas, who's here today. It's going to, as I said earlier, affect our economy, health, etc. So the approach that's taken right now, which is like taking a sledgehammer to the foundation of the department, makes it extremely challenging for state parks to enter into a sensible arrangement for park management. What I strongly suggest is that rather than putting our priceless state park system at risk, by adopting blunt force trauma with a proposed $22 million cut, we step back and look at a new model, which would be a multi-pronged approach at the local level, allowing services to be provided by those closest to the people, which is the idea with the criminal justice realignment. That's closure of state parks is going to be felt most acutely at the local level. Therefore, it makes sense to turn to the counties or a well-defined local governmental entity to work with state parks on solutions. I want to turn for a moment to Jack London State Park, which I know you're going to also be hearing about today. At Jack London in the Sonoma Valley, the Valley of the Moon Historical Society has spent countless hours and raised millions of dollars to completely restore Jack London's cottage. They manage the cottage, they help to pay to staff the park, and they do everything within their power to keep the vision and tremendous beauty of the park alive for all the visitors. Just last month, in one of the most inspiring events I've experienced, the Valley of the Moon Historical Society put on an event with Transcendence Theater Company that brought Broadway stars to perform in the old ruins of Jack London's winery. It brought revenue to the park, it brought huge joy to the visitors, but Jack London State Park is on the closure list. But once again, there's an opportunity to stop this occurring through an integrated approach. So Valley of the Moon, as you'll hear, has put in a proposal to run the park under the AB 42 framework, and this is to be admired. There's no question about it. Still, there are limitations to what the group can do, and I really want to emphasize that as we discuss AB 42 and nonprofit management of parks here today. They can't respond to crime in the park. They can't respond to fire or vandalism. All of these are going to require Sonoma County Sheriff and Fire Services. They also cannot be expected to fix damage to the cottage, whether it's by a falling branch in a storm or other unforeseen incidents. After spending millions of dollars to restore this cultural treasure so important to Californians, are we to simply abandon it at this time and leave it to the nonprofit to somehow come up with the funding to save it from decay? I would propose that it is incumbent upon us to find a better solution. And again, I believe it is through a funded and appropriate realignment type approach that we can do it. For each park set for closure in Sonoma County, and indeed I'm sure throughout the state, there are similar solutions. The key, in my mind, is to provide the time and a mechanism to look at each park in the context of its geography and its existing support network. The local park superintendents need to be fully empowered to work with the counties where that makes sense and with other governmental entities where appropriate. Funding has to be provided to parks to begin this new realignment with the understanding that it will be for a transition. The issue for you to consider today is whether you want to take hold of this process and do your duty as our representatives to help us preserve these amazing treasures, the system of parks which we have painstakingly built since 1864. I don't know about you, but I don't want to take part in this system's decline. I believe together we can find solutions which lead to the preservation of the state parks for ourselves and for our children, and I'm fully prepared to work with you, the governor, and state park staff on this new path. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Tom Peters from Marin Community Foundation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, members. I appreciate your holding this hearing. I'm here today actually wearing two hats. The first is, along with Assemblymember Huffman, co-chair of the Open Parks Coalition in Marin, which, like many communities up and down the state of California, certainly with our neighbors in Sonoma, with whom we've consulted quite productively, this is an incredible coming together of federal, state, local authorities, as well as many, many members of the community, members of the nonprofit organizations, advocacy organizations that really represent, again, I think, the kind of effort that is going on up and down the state of California. Before I took my current job, I was a public health doctor in San Francisco and Marin for many, many years. I've been in public life for a long time. I have rarely seen an issue that has galvanized such intense emotion and intense commitment to finding a solution as this issue of preserving these incredible treasures known as our state parks. My other hat today is as President and CEO of the Marin Community Foundation. Like all of your districts throughout California, there are community foundations representing essentially all California residents. We have the privilege of being one of the largest, not only in California, but in the nation. Let me speak just from that experience to apply to this issue that has been mentioned before about the philanthropic community. This is, I might just add parenthetically, a tough time to be a spokesperson for the 1%.
As long as you're doing philanthropy,
Yeah.
we're going to celebrate you, Tom.
But it does, quite seriously, I think that what has happened is a reflection. In our case, for example, we have a coalition of over 400 families that live in the San Francisco Bay Area primarily, but elsewhere in the country, over 400 families that have already set aside well over $1 billion, made that gift to philanthropy for purposes near and long term. So I do have the privilege and have had for the last 14 years of working with a number of families that are privileged in their economic standing, but also deeply committed to issues such as this parks issue. So let me attempt, with all modesty, to speak with regard to what it is that philanthropists need to see and need to know in terms of participating, as we deeply want to do, in the solutions that are facing this joint hearing and the legislature and indeed the state of California. I would suggest that in order to have families of considerable means be part of this solution, can't be the only part of it, and I do agree with previous speakers that in the long run there needs to be some balance and some accommodation to the public nature of these incredible resources, and therefore the public responsibility for some maintenance of their treasured status. But as participants in a solution, let me give 3 suggestions with regard to what philanthropic families are looking for in this discussion. First of all, already mentioned, the look at both sides of the ledger, efficiencies. You have said, Mr. Chairman, that there are many, many opportunities, I believe they exist up and down the state, to look at both sides of the ledger of any given state park, all of them that are threatened, and to look as closely as possible at efficiencies on the operating side, and certainly to look at the opportunities that exist on the revenue side. Any philanthropic investor, it's an investment opportunity, just as it would be in the financial market. This time for the public good. Philanthropy really is private dollars for the public good. And what we're looking for, though, in those investments are the same kinds of criteria that you would normally use in a financial investment. And we have had, for example, in the state parks of Marin, and I know it represents other parks as well throughout the state, but we have had enormous cooperation and coordination amongst the federal, state, and local authorities that really, I think, are working diligently to find a way to squeeze down and make as efficient as possible on the operating side, and some creative thinking on the revenue side. We need clarity from the state about those equations. Secondly, there is very definitely a need for an assurance, and a specific assurance from the state Parks Department, that donations made, philanthropic donations made, are in a dedicated or sequestered account that can be accounted for. It won't surprise you to know that families that have the means to help participate in this problem solving do want to know that if they put money into a particular account, put money with the motivation to help save a particular park, that they want to know that those funds are in a sequestered account and can be accounted for, even if they have to travel to Sacramento and back. There is a reasonable and accurate accounting. And finally, I would say that the by far and away, though we respect the fact that there may indeed be solutions park by park that rely on new providers, new participants in helping to run a park, I would say that if I were to approach the families that I know to work with, they're looking for a commitment to mission and a real real professionalism that I believe that the State Park Service and many of its volunteer organizations around it have provided. I think we would have a far greater appeal to private philanthropic resources if we could say that, yes, what this funding is going for is going to fund the professional status of the State Parks Department and its many dedicated employees in a way that assures that the parks actually are saved and that the very, very complex systems within each of these parks is adequately and professionally maintained. And most of all, there is the commitment to the mission of preservation, the mission of preserving the legacy that these parks have in California. All three of these factors combined, I believe, would lead many of us in the philanthropic community to step forward. We want to do it in partnership, but we also need the assurances that there can be a clarity of mission, of operation, of funding, and of accounting. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Peters. Ruskin Hartley from Save the Redwoods League. Welcome, Mr. Hartley.
Can I just ask
a
quick
please.
question before I appreciate your comments. I just wanted to understand the families that you've spoken of, interested in philanthropy, the $1 billion, which I'm sure is a rate across a multitude of causes and purposes. Probably would like far more than you've got. I mean, $1 billion seems like a big number, but it goes pretty fast.
Goes fast.
But were you speaking in terms of the interest in philanthropy with regard to state parks for the geographic area of Marin, or were you speaking on a statewide base? Yeah.
Generally. I'm really using it as an example to speak, as I know from my colleagues that run community foundations across the state of California and have this same kind of relationship with families that have both the means and the heart to be participating in this particular issue of keeping the state parks open. What I'm trying to indicate is that they want to know these criteria can be met, and also would be very, very wary, I might say, of seeing nonprofit organizations drawn because of the intense interest in preserving the park, drawn into an operating agreement that really exposes them to a liability and to legal challenges that they really couldn't sustain. And I believe that many, many nonprofits would be challenged under the uncertainty that pertains, at least now, with regard to those agreements.
Yeah, I understand the substance of your points perfectly, and they make great sense. I was more curious about the geographic reach of those with whom you work or are familiar, whether they're those who might be contributors to the Marin Community Fund or through some other avenue, not necessarily that one, other avenues, but within your knowledge or purview, that would be interested in saving a park in Mendocino or saving or Mono Lake or anywhere else.
We have donor families that on whose behalf we send checks regionally, nationally, and internationally, so that geography is not the defining issue.
Okay, good to know. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to speak. I'm Ruskin Hartley with Save the Redwoods League, and I can in fact attest to that several of our families who support the Redwoods do through the Marin Community Foundation. I love California state parks. I'm fortunate that they're both my vocation and they're also the place that my two boys, who are now 4 and 1, in essence learned to walk. And these parks, they're not there by accident. They weren't magically carved out of the public domain. They were put there by design and through the dedication of countless citizens, I would say both the 1% and the 99%. It's really been a broad-based movement. And they've put their faith in government to protect them. And today, as we face the first indefinite reductions in our park system's history, I want to share with you some of our history at, say, the Redwoods League, our assessment of the 16 redwood parks on the closure list, and some initial thoughts about how we dig out of this hole. So since 1918, say, the Redwoods League has dedicated itself to both protecting ancient redwoods and building parks for all to enjoy. Our model's pretty simple. We buy land from willing sellers, and traditionally we transfer it to the state, often at a 50%, most commonly at a 50% discount for inclusion in the state park system. In fact, the League has protected 630 properties in 40 state parks, covering almost 154,000 acres. That's about 10% of the system. Taking the closed parks alone, we've protected 48 properties, totaling some 8,310 acres. We don't have exact figures on the dollar amount of our contributions, but it's well in excess of $135 million of private contributions to these public parks. Our members donate to us with the expectation that the redwoods will be permanently protected and that we will work with the state to ensure that that is true. Accordingly, it is our practice to retain a deed restriction to ensure our donors' interests are protected. Now, as you might imagine, over 90 years, the form of restriction has varied. But in essence, it is best captured using the words of one of the earliest forms of restriction. And I quote, it says, "This grant is made to the state of California so that its citizens may enjoy this land in perpetuity." It is the League's expectation, as well as that of our donors, that the state will live up to its historic, its moral, and its legal obligations to satisfy the commitments set forth when it accepted ownership of those lands. So it's somewhat concerning that on June 30th, 2012, which is not many months away now, the gates will slam shut on 70 parks. And you can't really close a park. You know, the wildlife's going to enjoy it, but the people will not be able to enjoy a park when it's closed. The governor's office is calling these permanent reductions. Of those, a quarter are redwood parks. When the gates close, law-abiding citizens will be locked out, but you simply can't lock out the lawbreakers. In fact, you'll make criminals of people who decide to go and enjoy a park that they have used for maybe a generation. I cannot tell you what will happen in those closed parks because the state has never done this before. But I can tell you what is happening today in some of our open, and as you've heard, underfunded parks. At Henry Cowell Redwood State Park in Santa Cruz, our staff worked alongside state park rangers to remove pot gardens, complete with yards of black tubing, garbage bins of soil, and mounds of trash on a piece of property that we had previously transferred to them. This garden was a stone's throw from the main campground, minutes from downtown Santa Cruz. At Humboldt Redwood State Park and at Grizzly Creek, I have seen the carcass of 1,000-year-old redwood trees cut by thieves for split products. It is devastating to see an ancient giant butchered for split product in this way. And at Jug Handle State Reserve, in fact, on the day the closure list was announced, I was at the CALPA conference and decided I better go and take a walk in a park to clear my head. I actually ended up walking up a closed trail in the ecological staircase, so apologies for that. I was passed by mountain bikers, off-leash dogs, and all the time I had to avoid the piles of horse manure. Now, all those were illegal uses on the trail, even if the trail had been open. I wasn't obeying the closure sign, but at least I was obeying the ways you're meant to be using those trails. So I think, as you can see from the examples you decided, when we close parks, I expect that those impacts will only be magnitude. To quote a park superintendent, the best deterrent is having the law-abiding public around. It is these law-abiding citizens who we will be excluding. So where do we go from here? I've been thinking a lot about parks in the last few months. Not only do they protect special places, but the whole institution and system is special. Few other parts of state government have such a deep history of philanthropic support. What other part of state government is equal part museum, classroom, wildlife habitat, provider of clean air and water, engine of local economic development, and a world-class tourist attraction, apparently more visitors than Disneyland. State parks are not like highway patrol. They're not like schools. They're not like prisons. And that difference should be recognized, and it should inform the way the state identifies new ways to effectively operate these state parks. The good news is, as you are hearing, people want to help. The challenge is, under the current system, they simply don't know how they can be most effective. AB 42 was an important first step, and I certainly applaud you for that bold move. It has spurred many locally driven, let's call them rescue efforts, but many places on the closure list have no prospects of being saved. Our assessment of the 16 redwood parks suggests that maybe there's solutions for about half of them, consistent with what Elizabeth suggested. None are certain, and even the National Park Service rescue is year by year. Many of them face an uncertain future. So when I talk to our members about what, say, the Redwoods League should be doing to help parks, here's what they are telling me. First, they want to know that the money will go to support a particular park they care about. Second, they want to know that the state will not use it to cover further cuts. They want to know that their support adds value, not merely supplants funding. And third, they want to try new approaches. In essence, they're telling us they don't want to throw money at a system that is broken. They want us to help change the system to meet the immense challenges it is facing. If the old model was characterized by the state doing it all, the new model has to be where the park is a hub of activity from engaged citizens who care. Because this is uncharted territory, we don't know what these new models will look like. But there are examples that we can look to. You heard a little bit about Cavallo Point earlier. So the Golden Gate National Recreation Area is supported by a powerhouse nonprofit that raises money, but also provides frontline services in parks. They're very mission focused. And England, where I come from, incidentally, if you can't tell from the accent, the National Trust, this is revolutionary for a kid who grew up in National Trust homes, they started to drop the velvet ropes that define those parks and barred people from truly engaging them, and they started to tell people, yes, you can do that. And I find too often our parks here are characterized by listening of no. So what is the League going to do? First, we object to these cuts. Unfortunately, if the Department of Parks and Recreation is required to take this $33 million cut over 2 years on the heels of 25 years of declining budgets, the reality is they do need to look to closure and realignment. We've spread the butter across the toast too thin, or whatever analogy you want. Of course, cutting parks was not a budget necessity. It was a choice the administration made. $33 million is a rounding error in the state budget. If my math is right, it's barely enough money to keep the state running for 3 hours. The time scheduled for this hearing, incidentally. In fact, closing parks will deepen the budget hole as sales tax receipts decline. We believe that for all those reasons, these cuts are a short-sighted response to a very difficult, challenging budget time. Second, the League's focus is not on state parks per se. Our focus is on ensuring that the natural resources are protected and made accessible, even though the parks might be closed. The biggest threat from our assessment is wood theft, illegal drug cultivation, and the very significant threats to public safety that accompanies them. You will hear from the sheriff later. It terrifies me, the thought of sending untrained or somewhat trained volunteers into parks to deal with this. Someone was recently murdered on one of our properties in Mendocino County, and that was someone who knew what they were doing. I don't want to scare people about what's going on, but we need to be thinking about the public safety aspects. So we are ready to work with the state to protect these resources, but ultimately we're holding the governor and our elected officials accountable to their fate when these parks close. And third, we will work with local groups to step up and help out. We believe the best deterrence against natural resource damage is a strong local presence in the park. If these local groups continue to provide public access, even better. We support that. So what are we asking the legislature and the administration to do? Some of this will seem familiar. We need you to commit to protecting existing levels of general fund support, even in the tough times ahead. Further cuts to DPR will leave it with no ability to help itself. Such a commitment would also provide incentives to the department, its partners, and our donors to find creative ways of bringing new resources to the table. Second, given the department, you need to give the department the authorities it needs to become more entrepreneurial and to help itself by generating additional revenue through mission-related activities. Parks are perhaps unique in all of state government that people will happily pay to use them if they're provided services. This needs to be accommodated, acknowledged, and parks need to be run differently. And finally, this closure has happened, as we heard earlier, 3 weeks. Leave aside what their process is and whether they showed they're working. 3 weeks to make decisions about reductions in parks? I'm sorry. That doesn't seem like a responsible approach. I think the time has come to call for a new plan for state parks that looks at new roles for the public, private, and non-profit sector. How can we harness the energies of these various sectors and non-profit community to not just plug the current budget gap, but to start digging out the enormous backlog of deferred maintenance present today and to build the parks our children and our grandchildren need? This work is different. It's more challenging than at any point in the long history of state parks. But our focus at the League remains the same. We need to ensure that the state's majestical, beautiful redwood groves, unique in the world, are protected and made accessible to the public. We know we cannot do it alone. It's going to take strong leadership. It's going to take willingness for the administration to do things differently. It's going to need the unwavering support of the legislature, and it's going to need the willingness to let the Legion of Park supporters in as full partners in this grand experiment. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hartley. Go to our
final panelist here.
You just hold the mic towards you.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll just see you looking. Oh, I'm looking ahead. Okay. Thanks. I'm Carol Berman. I'm president of the Benicia State Parks Association. And it's a position that I held in 1980. I haven't been there the whole time. In between, I had a career as a elementary school teacher, which I took fourth graders through all the California State Park, historical parks, Sutter's Fort, including our Capitol building in Benicia. And I thank you for the hearing today. This is like a little like a parent-teacher conference. You know, what have you done? What have I done? And how come it's not coming out and working right? Yeah, that hits home, doesn't it? Okay. We actually call it Protect the Parks in Benicia because once you've saved anything, it's over. So we're Protect the Parks is what we've adopted in Benicia. We have 30,000 residents in Benicia, not very big. We have two parks, basically. We have the Benicia Historic Park, which includes the Capitol Building, which is the only standing pre-Sacramento building, 1852 building, operated for about 11 months from 1853 to 1854. And I don't know if any of you went to the 2000 legislative session, but they had that in the Senate chambers in Benicia. The other historic site is the Fisher Hanlon House, which shows how upper middle class family may have lived in the 19th century, fully stored with artifacts, as if someone had just left the dining room dishes on the table. The other part of it is the recreation area, which is at the other end of town, and that's a natural preserve. We're right downtown with the historic areas. We're right off of First Street. We end at the water, and we start down at the gazebo. We run from M to B Street because A is in the water, and we're halfway in between. We're on G Street, which is where the brick building is and the house. The other end of town is the recreation area. We have a real can-do philosophy in Benicia. The state capitol is a state landmark. It had restoration in 1958, and primarily with a great deal of community support and funding. The Fisher Hanlon House has had continual family ownership until it was deeded to the state in 1968 by the two Hanlon sisters, who were two of the three at that time. One was deceased, descendants of Joseph Fisher, who had the house moved from a location in downtown Benicia. And in the deed to that house, which I've actually submitted to you, it says that the house is to be held in trust in behalf of the people of California forever. 90% of the significant artifacts in the house belong to the family. Artifacts are a real problem, a real curatorial problem for the state, for us, for everyone. In the state recreation area, there's a 720-acre wetland reserve. And as is stated on the list that you have, access cannot be denied due to the federal funding. There's an ABAG grant of condition that stipulates the Bay Trail, which runs through there, and the Ridge Trail cannot have access denied until 2032. My 4-year-old granddaughter will be 23 years old then. In that park, there's a botanical garden that, when you're talking about value, there's over $100,000 in grants that's gone into that garden, which is in the recreation area, and $350,000 in volunteer hours. I know this because I worked closely with Jean Doherty, who has supported this non-closure issue. And we go back to 06, 07, 08, 09, and I reapplied to have our agreement extended in the association in between 09 and 010 because I could see what was coming. You could see it. We're talking years back. We knew this was coming. It was inevitable. So as far as planning, I just kind of shake my head there. we're already having reduced operations. Our historic sites are open 2 days a week. We're open Saturday and Sunday. The house is open when we have volunteers, as myself, docents available to give tours. And the recreation area is open to vehicular traffic 5 days a week. And let me tell you, the Fisher people out there are hopping mad because they buy passes to go out there to fish, and it's a 2.2-mile walk. And if you have any sort of disability or you're over 62 years old and not physically able, it's real hard to get out there. So they're real upset about that item. I mentioned all these problems because a lot of the information I got had to be researched. And this is not slamming the Parks Department, but anything I got about ABAG, anything I got about the federal monies, anything I got with regards to the deed, or monies that are in a fund to help the parks once they are not open anymore, came from the California Parks Foundation. There were no facts, figures that had been given to me over the months. And we're talking going back pre-May, when we started in addition to the nonprofit that we have, a stakeholders committee, which is now 100 strong. And it covers all aspects from finance, fundraising, to even maintenance. And people say, well, why are you doing that? You know, we don't have anything to do. We don't have any windows to fix. And believe me, there are $3.5 million of deferred maintenance in those buildings. It's there. And I said, you know, you have to be ready. The flood is coming, you know. The disaster is coming. It's not waiting at the door. It is there. You have got to be ready. You know, people say that I'm, you know, OCD. No, I'm CDO. I put it in alphabetical order, you know. So that's why I shared some of those things. We actually do have a proposal on the table. We're real unique, I think, with regards to the panel here, maybe not unique in the whole group, but we're combining with the city, our nonprofit association, with the stakeholder support, which is a committee. It's not a nonprofit. It's a committee of people. We have a 3-part proposal, and the city and the state has already met. The State Department of Parks and Recreation have already met. They met in October, and the state liked what they saw. They said, you know, you need a few more details in here. As they put a little more meat into the program. There's 3 parts. Proposal 1, the city is, we're a small town, remember? So that's why we got those city folks in there. Is to keep access to the recreation area open with some grounds will be maintained and access to 1 bathroom, because 1 bathroom is on a septic field. It is so badly failed that it's going to have to be abandoned. And the city already has plans that they could give to support to put in a porta potty, and they've done this in other parks in the city where they built it in, where it cannot be vandalized, it cannot be removed, it can't be toppled. So there are avenues for doing that. It's put into a gazebo. They're also supplying utilities and materials, you know, the basic things you need to run bathrooms, etc. Proposition 2 is caring for the grounds and the bathroom at the historic site. Small town, we have 3 public bathrooms downtown, one of which is the Capitol. And not too many cities can say that. You know, you end up going into the restaurants. That also includes utilities and supplies paid there. So that really helps our association because we're not looking at that cost at the historic park. The third proposal is where the association and their stakeholders and the citizens come in. The volunteers and docents are recruited, trained, and scheduled for interpretive tours of the Capitol and the House. We right now have 42 people in a docent training program, but we don't know what the state requirements are going to be for what are called the Volunteers and Parks program. I'm a real detailed person. You know, I want to know, am I going to have to get fingerprinted? You know, is my friend going to have to get fingerprinted? And are we going to have to go to the police department again for a background check? I have answers, you know, about so, and questions about so. This grassroots group have helped with the raising of funds. We're not in the millions of dollars, but we've raised about $8,000 so far, and this was without a major outreach. because just as my friend said over here, we don't know what we're gearing it to. We do know it's going to stay in Benicia. Okay, we don't have enough money to spread it around. It's wonderful if you can be a philanthropic organization, but it's staying in Benicia. And that's what people say. If I give you money, Carol, what's that going to do?
Mm-hmm.
And we have it in an account in the Benicia State Parks Association says protect the Benicia State Parks. And so that's where it goes, and that's where it's up right now. There would be costs included in the volunteer docent program. There is what's called an ongoing cost of keeping the parks closed, and there's cost of closure is about $100,000 at one park and about $25,000 at the other. Again, I got these facts and figures through a source through California Parks Foundation. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't have had access to them. We're hoping to apply for some of that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So for $124,000, you may be able to help keep them open.
Yes, yes. And
That's good.
and the big thing is volunteer. The big cost of the capital has been personnel.
Right.
In opening, closing parks, operating the park for tours, for visitors. Personnel is a huge, huge cost. Deferred maintenance.
Ms. Berman, we're going to need to wrap
Okay.
up, but I hate to cut you short.
Okay, I'm all the way down here. I already talked about the multi-million-dollar deferred maintenance. For years and years, we've had an omnipresent state parks function with supervisory control, and now we're asked to formulate a proposal. And we haven't been given a lot of information. We're not going to operate under the old standing agreement. I know there's a new one. We'll see what that looks like. Our capital windows, indeed, have been measured for plywood. The historic gardens have been evaluated for replacement after abandonment. We need some discussion between the Parks Department and groups such as ours. We need vision. I have a friend who says this is the Wild West, but the West is closing next summer. And if we don't get it together with calm hearts, open minds, and a better exchange of information and resolutions, we're going to lose some of our park treasures. Things such as selling more park passes, selling them in other outlets, selling a museum pass. We have a number of small museums in Benicia. Charging more for interpretive tours, school tours, parking fees, because we're looking at a longer term. And maybe we can bring that vehicle tax back.
All right. Well,
Thank
on
you.
that note, thank you very much. Very much appreciate these local perspectives, the commitment all of you are showing in your own way to addressing this problem. So thank you. We're going to go to our final panel, which is going to look at the hidden costs of state park closures. Ms. Yamada is going to make a comment while
Yes,
the panel's coming
exactly.
up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I wanted to apologize for my hour-long absence. There was another matter ongoing, but I did want to thank my constituents in particular from Benicia. I wanted to mention that, and please come on forward while I'm making this quick comment, that I know that the mayor in particular of the city of Benicia and others have been very proactive in ensuring that both of the state parks in Benicia are fully engaged in the discussion about how we're going to weather this storm. And I think we have resources in that community that foster that. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Great. Thank you, Assemblymember Yamada. Welcome to our final panel. Thanks, everyone, for your patience. We've gone a little past time, and I know everybody's getting hungry, but we're gonna wrap it up with this panel. So why don't you start in with our first witness, please? I think we've got you first, Sheriff Freitas. Welcome. Yeah, you can pull that right around.
Okay, good afternoon to the chairs and other assembly members. Thank you very much for letting me address you today about this very important topic. I'm Steve Freitas. I'm the sheriff of Sonoma County. I completely understand the difficult financial situation that the state is in. In Sonoma County, we're facing the same issue, as evidenced by the fact that my general fund budget has been cut by 20% over the past 2 years. Sonoma County is facing the closure of 5 state parks. In August, the California State Sheriff's Association was told by a state parks administrator that it would cost too much to effectively secure the parks from public access, and therefore there would likely still be people visiting, camping, and engaging in other activities in the parks. Currently, law enforcement patrol and response in these parks is provided by state park rangers. If the state abandons this service for these parks, I've been told by my county council and the state sheriff's general counsel that I, as sheriff, have to do it. I don't have a choice. The issue is the local budget cuts I mentioned earlier. I lost 51 positions this year alone in my office. Therefore, I am quite frankly unable to perform these duties unless I do so at the expense of my other constitutional requirements. Unfortunately, I was unable to get statistics from the state about crimes and other calls for service that take place in state parks. However, I think it is fair to assume that there will be some level of law enforcement service needed in these closed parks, from some of the more minor things that we've heard about today to trespassing and camping, to other things like vandalism, some of the more serious things. I'm sure if we close these parks that are near urban areas, many fit that bill in Sonoma County, it will lead to large gatherings of teens and other young adults who typically then involve alcohol that ultimately require a law enforcement response. And then several people today have mentioned illegal marijuana grows. And we have had 2 murders in Sonoma County this year around marijuana grows on public lands. And there is no denying the fact it has nothing to do with medical marijuana and the pros and cons of medical marijuana, but there is a direct correlation of violence with public land marijuana grows. There's no way around it. The Sonoma County Sheriff's Office has been a good partner to the state parks. We provide service for major crime investigations. We provide backup for state park rangers, and I have willingly used my rescue resources, such as our Marine unit and helicopter services, to help state park rangers. However, to make me responsible for all law enforcement in the state parks is something that will take away valuable core services from the citizens of Sonoma County. I'm sure you're all familiar with the state's criminal justice realignment plan that has been mentioned here today. The plan calls for the shifting of responsibilities for some prisoners and parolees to counties, with the state providing the funding for this service. This state park closure is basically a realignment with no funding. I'm aware that there are groups, both public and private, who are working to save some of the state parks. However, I have not heard any of these groups that has a plan to respond for calls for crimes for service in these parks. I found it interesting today that the attorney for the parks talked about that the state had divested itself of liability if things go wrong in the parks. It sounds like since I'm now responsible, I think I know where that liability is headed. Additionally, there's a plan for stewardship for biological and cultural resources, but no plan for law enforcement response. I have not been consulted by anyone from state parks about law enforcement response in these parks that are due to be closed. Ironically, I received a letter yesterday from a gentleman who is a retired state park ranger, and he is working to save Jack London State Park. His letter to me was asking to meet with me to discuss my plan for my levels of service in the park, should he be able to save it. And that's the problem. People are assuming that sheriffs can provide this service when most of us are not in a position to do so. I can assure you that I have spoken with several of my colleague sheriffs around the state, and they are in complete agreement with what I am telling you here today. I sincerely hope that some other solution can be found to provide law enforcement services to these parks. I am even open to the idea of realignment and providing the service should the state provide the funding for me. However, I would implore you that if that is not possible, I respectfully request that state parks or some other state entity maintain responsibility for law enforcement in these parks. Thank you again for letting me address you today.
Thank you, Sheriff Freitas. Very, very important perspective that we really haven't heard at all on this issue until now, so we appreciate that. Did you want to jump in, Mr. Chesbro?
Yes, thank you very much, Sheriff. And I might add there are other sheriffs to your north who were unable to be here today, one of whom left a voice message on my cell phone early this morning expressing the same concerns that you've brought to us today. I really appreciate it. And, of course, you're talking about your department's responsibilities, but there are associated with that, if you're unable because of your resources being spread so thin, tremendous impacts potentially on the parks in terms of public safety and environmental hazards. So I really appreciate you bringing this to our attention. And frankly, I don't think it was adequately addressed by the state parks representatives who were before us earlier, and I would encourage the committee to ask for a response on the question of law enforcement and public safety, because some of us brought it up, but I think to hear a law enforcement perspective in a county where the park closure proposals will have a big impact really crystallizes it in a way that I think they need to do some more explaining about how how the governor and the department intend to protect the environment and the public from hazards in the absence of, or alternately to pay for law enforcement if they're willing to put the money forward to support having the county do it.
Realignment without the funding is a pretty good description of what's going on, so we appreciate that. Nina Gordon, welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman Huffman, Chairman Dickinson, and members of the Assembly Water Parks and Wildlife Committee, and the Accountability and Administrative Review Committee, and other members invited to this hearing. My name is Nina Gordon. I am president of the California State Park Rangers Association, otherwise known as CSPRAY. CSPRAY was founded in 1964 and is a professional organization representing a wide variety of classifications of state park employees, including rangers and lifeguards, maintenance staff, interpreters, historians, archaeologists, and administrative staff professionals. We would like to help bring to your attention some of the hidden costs of closing state parks, and we'll address 3 points. One is rising crime, which is very good following your presentation, resource and facility degradation, and the true cost of developing sustainable partnerships. Point number 1, rising crime. According to Department crime statistics, in 1998, there were approximately 23,000 crimes reported. In 2009, there were over 73,000 crimes reported and over 98,000 other incidents requiring response. State parks experience the same crimes found in cities and counties, as you've been hearing. Crimes include everything from murder, child abuse, rape, armed robbery, assault with deadly weapons, domestic violence, drug dealing and cultivation, theft of cultural and natural resources, and vandalism of facilities. If parks are closed, these activities will not stop. Rather, they will continue to impact the parks along with the surrounding communities. Keeping parks open will help keep them safe by minimizing crime and minimizing resource and facility infrastructure damage. Other state and local law enforcement agency budgets and staffing are stretched to the limits. As you've been hearing, their ability to incur the additional workload of closed parks may not be possible or desirable. Many of our parks are in very remote areas, making response time by other law enforcement agencies extremely delayed, if at all possible. Second point, resource and facility degradation. Closing a state park will add to the breakdown of an already deteriorating infrastructure of roads, buildings, restrooms, wastewater treatment plants, historic structures, and other public facilities. This is known as demolition by neglect. The deferred maintenance backload, as you know, is already over $1 billion. For example, shutting down water lines will cause many of the seals located in the lines to dry out, and the department may find itself having to replace miles of pipeline. If the department's water and sewage treatment plant permits expire in closed parks, we could be facing huge costs to comply with the required upgrades to renew the permit. We are already seeing increased vandalism, including rampant theft of copper pipes and other metals, with money being used from the sale of these metals to support such activities as drug trafficking. Closing parks will also cause the deterioration of the natural environment, such as the spread of non-native species, which in turn requires additional funds to restore the habitat to its original healthy state. Additionally, lack of resource protection poses threats to threatened and endangered species in several of the parks scheduled for closure. The majority of parks on the closure list are state historic parks. One cannot just close the door and walk away. Vandalism, theft, and deterioration will increase. There will likely be looting of archaeological features, including Native American sites in these unprotected areas. Another significant hidden cost is the time-consuming and labor-intensive process of protecting irreplaceable cultural artifacts in our closed parks. This includes inventorying, cataloging, meticulous preparation for moving, and then the parallel process to properly and safely store the collections. It is critical to have cultural staff on site to handle problems as they occur. These include unstable foundations, leaking roofs and windows, mold, and pest damage. If you close the park, these will continue to fester and result in increased future costs. Petaluma Adobe State Historic Park is an example, as adobe structures require consistent protection to prevent water and other environmental damage. Materials used in protecting adobe bricks must be carefully prepared and applied by trained staff, and repairing and stabilizing adobe structures is very costly. Third point and last point, cost of developing sustainable partnerships. CSPRAY supported AB AB 42, and we really appreciate the opportunities that it provides. However, as was stated in the Sacramento Bee editorial yesterday, October 31st, partnerships are not a panacea. We know that partnerships strengthen California state parks, bringing in critical funding and other resources, more park advocates, in addition to building bridges to diverse communities. However, a successful and sustainable partnership requires trained state park staff. Potential partners must first be screened for economic viability to ensure that all mission-critical functions will be provided. In addition, once the nonprofit organizations are identified, appropriate professional staff is needed to develop the necessary and appropriate legal agreements, such as MOUs, execute those agreements, and then evaluate and monitor the services and funding arrangements to ensure that they comply with federal and state regulations and are consistent with the state park mission. Potential partnerships also involve the continued costs of state park operation. A number of potential partners seek the revenue-generating elements of a park unit operation, leaving the remainder of the operation, usually the maintenance, law enforcement, and resource management functions, to be completed by specialized park staff. Much of this work requires specially educated, certificated, and experienced staff, which most potential partners do not have. All partnership agreements must also ensure that federal and state laws, such as NEPA and CEQA, are followed. Malakoff-Diggins State Historic Park, the site of California's largest hydraulic mine, is an example of all three of the above points. Law enforcement assistance by other agencies is very problematic due to the very remote location. There are already indications that people are trying to remove the historic water cannons at the park. The park contains numerous historic buildings and structures which must be placed in caretaker status or mothballed if closed. Any prospective partner wishing to operate the park must have the specialized personnel and resources to comply with the relevant laws, regulations, and procedures to preserve the historic resources. So in closing, I wanted to say that these public trust resources are part of the very fabric of California, its people, and our heritage. They must not be exploited or irreversibly damaged in the short term so that we may return once again intact for future generations the parks. Parks belong to us, our children, our grandchildren, and the next generations to come. The National Trust for Historic Preservation listed California State Park System as a whole on their list of America's most endangered places. Do not let them become extinct. We have the responsibility to preserve and protect these irreplaceable treasures that are our heritage. Thank you for this opportunity to address the committees.
Thank you. Quick question for you, Ms. Gordon. You and your members have unique expertise on things like theft and vandalism and damage from things like that could happen to our state park system. Has the department sought your input on trying to put a price tag on that with respect to its closure plan?
As was stated earlier, there was a group of superintendents who we know personally have a long history with the parks, but they have not sought specifically the input from the State Park Rangers Association. There has been a website available for people to respond to, but we would appreciate the opportunity to have more direct involvement in the process.
Okay, thank you. Next witness, please.
Chairman Huffman and Dickinson and honorable committee members, thank you for having me here today to participate. My name is Jeff McQuilkin. I'm the executive director of the Mona Lake Committee. We're a 16,000-member nonprofit organization that's been committed for over 30 years to Mona Lake protection, restoration, and education programs. The state park at Mona Lake, which is called the Mona Lake Tufa State Natural Reserve, a nice mouthful, good name, is twice the size of San Francisco. It covers 77 square miles of very unique lake and shoreline lands, providing critical public access and resource management programs. It's on the closure list, of course, and this has proven to be a major public concern. We've had over 4,000 letters and petition signatures submitted to the governor and the Parks Director's office this year, as well as our local legislators. Assemblymember Olson has been out personally to visit the lake, which is very much appreciated. For this panel, let me focus on 4 hidden costs of park closure that we've identified in the course of our work on this issue. They're Mona Lake focused, but we think they're probably irrelevant to many of the park units. The first one is that existing park support programs will be lost. It's not news that we have budget challenges for the state park system. That's been a case for a number of years. And in response, nonprofits, the Mona Lake Committee, others have created volunteer and nonprofit fundraising programs to support the operation of the Mona Lake Reserve. If you close the park, these support systems start to shut down, and they're not easy to reactivate. Your volunteers move on. There's plenty of other places to volunteer, for example. Our 9-year-old volunteer program has over 40 people that are out in the field, and they're providing information, roving educational context, even formal interpretive tours in partnership with state personnel. On the fundraising side, the official cooperating association for the Mono Lake Reserve is called the Bodie Foundation, and it's been funding the salary of the state's seasonal interpretive specialist position for a number of years. The committee raises funds to support education and stewardship projects that are conducted within the reserve year-round. And again, with the reserve is closed, then you lose the ability to do those fundraising and volunteer activities. Second, park closures will create damaging economic impacts. And what we've seen is that they're really going to ripple far beyond the closed park itself. It's really evident in the tourism-based economy of Mono County and in the small town of Lee Vining, population 400, where I live. We talk with thousands, tens of thousands of visitors annually. And what we've seen in talking with them this year is that once the closed label is applied to a park, even if it's in the future, the confusion spreads rapidly. Is Mono Lake closed today, next year? We can sort that out. How about Bodie State Historic Park? It's just up the road. Well, no, it's not on the closure list, but people are starting to get confused. How about the National Forest? People think the National Forest might be closing. Yosemite, maybe the Yosemite Gate's closed. About 40% of our visitors in our area are international, or they're coming from out-of-state locations, and they simply don't have time or resources to sort out what agency has put what status on what park or what public lands. Once they see the closed label, they start to make new plans, and that gives us a big hit on the tourism economy. And that can be, go far beyond skipping visiting that closed park. They may skip visiting the Eastern Sierra entirely. They might compress a 4-day visit into one day. They might pick an entirely different western state to go and visit on their United States trip. Third, the unique legal situations at many park units can lead to further unforeseen closure costs, and this is certainly true at the Mono Lake Reserve. The reserve was created by legislation that was authored by John Garamendi back in 1981, and it specifically directed state parks to provide public access ways to Mono Lake. So closure directly violates this legal mandate, raising questions about complying with the original law, of course, and also about liability. What happens when our adventurous visitors start to make their own paths down to the lake, maybe across private property or through sensitive wetlands? I think even more significantly, the Mono Lake Reserve is composed of sovereign state lands and waters that have been owned by the people since California entered the Union. There's been, of course, major public trust resources and precedents set at Mono Lake and major realignment of water rights to reflect the value of Mono Lake and these resources to the people of California. Closure would cause state parks to violate its duties to protect these resources, but it would also violate its duties to the State Lands Commission, which is the ultimate administrator and manager of these lands. So shuffling duties could occur between state agencies, but if state park starts passing costs to State Lands Commission, it may be very much like the law enforcement situation being discussed here. You're not achieving net savings. You're passing unfunded management mandates between agencies and hoping someone will pick up and do the work. In the end, I think the current management of Mono Lake is, in fact, the most cost-effective method out there. The expert state park staff have the experience and the resources to do the job well and efficiently. Lastly, the state park system is, of course, an interwoven fabric of many individual park units. And at the Mono Lake Reserve, park rangers work in coordination with Bodie State Historic Park. It's about 30 miles up the road. In a time of reduced service levels, funding freezes, hiring freezes, and so forth, Bodie is also short-staffed. It's scheduled to be opened, but many days Bodie would actually have no law enforcement ranger presence, but for the Mono Lake Ranger spending his day at the Bodie site. So if the Mono Lake Reserve is closed, operations at Bodie become that much more difficult. Also, Mono Lake contributes to achieving system-wide state park goals, such as providing adequate ADA access to the parks. Mono Lake has over 2 miles of recently constructed and renovated ADA accessible trails and boardwalks. Shut down the park, and the state is now moving backward on ADA compliance. At Mono Lake, we're hopeful we can avoid incurring these hidden costs by utilizing the volunteer and nonprofit support networks that are already in place, combined with appropriate fees for visitors. We're hopeful that we can figure out a way to keep the Mono Lake Reserve open and operating for all of us to visit in future years. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss these things today, and be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Next witness, Kathy Bailey from the Anderson Valley Chamber of Commerce, and we have a brochure with your county supervisors, so we know that you're speaking for them as well on this.
Yes, thank you. Good morning. Thank you very much for having this hearing. My name is Kathy Bailey, and I am pleased to be here representing the Anderson Valley Chamber of Commerce. We hope that the information we provide today will convince you that hurting our businesses and our local economy by closing Hendy Woods State Park is highly unlikely to improve the state's economy or help balance the state budget. Additionally, I have been asked by the Mendocino County Board of Supervisors to personally deliver the letter they unanimously adopted at their last meeting, and you have that there. Members certainly would have been here this morning, but the timing conflicted with their regular board meeting. They hope you will consider the letter in lieu of their testimony. Just so you have an idea of who is addressing you there, you have the photo. It's a good group of people, and each of them has a long history in the county. In brief, their letter states that in 2009, tourism pumped $297 million into the county economy and is the county's most important economic driver. Tourism employs more people than any other industry. Tax dollars attributable to tourism are a very significant part of the county's budget, and further, tourism-related taxes remitted to the state in 2009 amounted to an additional $12.3 million. A 2008 study concluded that 74% of our visitors spend time in our state parks, and they rank the quality of our parks as high, ranking them 4.6 on a scale of 5. In spite of all this, as you have heard, when the park closure list was published, 8 of the 70 parks on the closure list, more than 10% of the total, were in only one of the county's 58, or the state's 58 counties, Mendocino County. The Mendocino County Board of Supervisors suggests that you reconsider whether closing parks is an economically sound way to help balance the state budget. And if some parks must be targeted, they strongly urge you to revise the criteria the Parks Department uses to identify closures to include consideration of the economic effects of the proposed closure on both the community businesses and the county. Turning now to our specific situation in Anderson Valley, one of the targeted parks is Hendy Woods State Park near Philo in Anderson Valley, our community's only state park. Anderson Valley is a community of around 3,200 people. We're spread out along almost 40 miles of State Route 128 in west central Mendocino County. There are 4 towns, Yorkville, Boonville, Philo, and Navarro, and pockets of population in the hills above the valley. Almost nowhere in Anderson Valley is closer than 35 minutes away from the nearest town outside of the valley, and from most places, it's a much longer time to get anywhere else. Although we are isolated in one way, we are also conveniently located to the urban centers to the south. On a good day, Boonville is about 2.5 hours away from the Golden Gate. Besides Hendy Woods, Anderson Valley's only other parks are a playground and a very small county park of around 15 acres. Not so long ago, the valley's economic life revolved around sheep, apples, and logging redwood timber. More recently, tourism has come to dominate our economy, including tourism focused on tasting and buying our premium wines and our well-known local beer. One of our strengths as a visitor destination is our diversity. We can provide a relaxing time in beautiful surroundings with a variety of activities available that appeal to a broad range of people. Closing Hendy Woods will rip the heart out of that mix. Here are some of the other features of Hendy Woods and what visitors will lose if it closes. Hendy Woods is over 816 acres of mostly forest land with some meadows. It has 2 groves of ancient redwoods totaling 80 acres, which are the only easily accessed redwood groves, ancient redwood groves, not only in Anderson Valley, but in all of Mendocino County. People come to Mendocino County specifically to see and experience ancient redwoods, but without Hendy Woods, they will be going elsewhere, most likely out of the county. There are 94 campsites, by far the largest and most popular campgrounds in the area. Without camping, middle-income people and families will be largely priced out of an overnight stay. Closing the campsites at Hendy will eliminate more than 90% of the campsites in Anderson Valley. The park has several miles of frontage on the Navarro River and is the only place in the valley with public access to the river. Without the park, there will be no place for anyone, visitor or local alike, to cool off and swim on a hot summer's day. We have no public swimming pool. Crisscrossing the park are miles of hiking trails and paths that are safe for walking and biking. These trails and paths are the only public place in all of Anderson Valley where visitors and locals can walk or take a hike of any duration other than alongside a heavily used road or highway. Without Hendy Woods, it is reasonable to assume we will lose a very substantial portion of our visitors. They will not be around to buy beer or wine, eat restaurant meals, stock up at our stores, or buy gifts at our galleries, nor will they pay sales tax on any of those items. I note in the statistical report the state provides that the total visitor attendance at Hendy Woods is 49,712 in an actually relatively low visitor year. And of those, camping attendance is 38,295 people. So imagine that number of people in a community of 3,200 total, and you see what kind of impact that this is going to have on the business community. Because no one will have a peaceful, safe place to take a walk, hike, or bike, including people staying at a bed and breakfast or an expensive vacation rental for $150 or more a night, it seems likely these customers will also go elsewhere. They won't be paying us their rent, nor will they be paying the 11% tax on accommodations, nor will they be buying beer or wine, eating restaurant meals, stocking up at our stores, or buying gifts. And they won't be paying sales tax on any of those items either. Every business in Anderson Valley will experience a significant hit on its revenues if Hendy Woods is closed. Some will weather the storm, but others will not. Since the economic downturn, Anderson Valley, like so many other communities, has been struggling to maintain the basic institutions that allow our community to function. Each of these has experienced financial strain thanks to nearly catastrophic cutbacks by the county and state. For instance, a few years ago, the community raised around $1 million in donations and borrowed close to $2 million more to update and expand the Anderson Valley Health Center, which has been in operation more than 35 years. Within less than 6 months of opening the door on the remodeled building, the state eliminated a full third of the funding for the clinic, resulting in a fiscal emergency. Around that time, state funding was eliminated for our fairground, which hosts many events throughout the year that bring thousands of visitors to Anderson Valley. Simultaneously, county budget woes and the untimely off-duty death of a deputy left the people of Anderson Valley doing battle with county officials to avoid cutbacks to our deputy sheriff coverage. Meanwhile, of course, we were continuing to field our volunteer fire department and the Volunteer Ambulance Association, which responds to all incidents on Highway 128 and elsewhere in the community. Then, as community members were desperately writing letters, raising money, and crafting plans to try to raise the health center, we got word that the state planned to shut down Hendy Woods State Park, a centerpiece of the valley's economic activity. Fortunately, it's not all bad news. This August, the health center, in competition with over 800 other applicants nationwide, was one of 67 entities nationwide, only 2 of which were health facilities that received life-saving federal funding. So the specter of that catastrophe has been eliminated, at least for the time being. And that brings us to today. We in Anderson Valley ask you, does doing great harm to most of our businesses by closing Hendy Woods State Park really help the general fund? It seems unlikely to us. We strongly believe that every park is important. It took decades of effort to create Hendy Woods, and we assume the same is true for each of the other state parks. However, we also strongly believe that some parks are more important to the economy of their community than others. We know Hendy Woods is one of those parks. Along with the letter from the Anderson Valley Chamber of Commerce, you also have letters from the Anderson Valley Wine Growers Association and the Anderson Valley Community Services District, as well as the letter from the Mendocino County Board of Supervisors. We all are asking you to reconsider the economic ramifications of park closures, and particularly the criteria that are being used to determine which parks will close.
Thank you.
We believe...
We have to ask you to wrap up, Ms. Bailey.
Yes, one more sentence, I believe.
Okay.
We believe that if the purpose of the closures is to balance the state budget, then one must consider the economic effect of closing those parks. Please help us keep Hendy Woods State Park open.
Thank you very much. We appreciate your testimony.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
First of all, I'd like to echo Ms. Bailey's description of the fabulous Anderson Valley, and encourage everybody to go visit.
Thank you.
Love the beer, love the wine, love the natural beauty. It's really a spectacular place. Everyone who's watching and listening, that's the positive. On the negative, actually, I very much appreciate the cumulative impact description that was just given. I don't know. I'm sorry, I had to step out for the caucus discussion and missed other testimony. I don't know if anybody else brought it up.
In a park-specific way, we haven't heard it.
But I think ticking off all of the impacts on rural communities and then pointing out that this is layered on top of all those other impacts was really a useful and important point to make. So I want to thank you for that.
Thank you, Assemblyman.
Yeah, absolutely. So our final witness from Pio Pico, welcome.
Yes, thank you. I noticed I have the notoriety of being the last on the list and the only representative of Southern California. So I hope I do them justice. My name is Carolyn Schoaf, and I'm the president of the California League of Park Associations, also known as CALPA. We're the umbrella organization for the cooperating associations and nonprofits that serve California state parks. And I also serve as the president of the Friends of Pio Pico, a cooperating association for Pio Pico State Historic Park located in the Los Angeles area that has been open as a historic site for 102 years. And we are one of the parks on the closure list slated for July 1st, 2012. So I've been asked to speak about both my organizations and the hidden cost of closing state parks. And I have to be honest, outlining the hidden cost of state park closures is really difficult. Never in the history of state parks has this happened, and across the state we are still trying to figure out what park closures really mean. There's no easy answer. CALPA, as an organization, has been meeting with the Department of Parks and Recreation on a regular basis to try to figure out what the closures mean and how our organizations can help mitigate it. And today, rather than focus on the enormous loss of historical, cultural, and environmental resources we face in closing parks, which we've heard a lot about, I would like to focus on other factors. And I want to start out with 2 points. First, it would take hours to discuss with you the myriad of hidden costs for closing state parks. And second, I would like to point out these hidden costs do not apply just to parks on the closure list. They apply to all of our California state parks. As the reduction in overall spending on state parks has declined over the past few decades, and even more drastically over the past few years, leaving all parks with reduced hours and reduced services. In many cases, these reductions have led to negative public opinion, and the animosity over the past few years has led to resentment for state park employees who, to their credit, have been following instructions to focus their resources on revenue generation at the expense of other services. But let's face it, reduced hours and services mean lower attendance, less revenue, and in the end, fewer donations. So closing parks has created a domino effect for us, from which we believe we may never recover. There's also a culture of mistrust of government that has developed in our society today. And people see the state as inefficient, and people are not willing to contribute money to a system they feel is inefficient and wasteful. And this has impacted state parks even further as the public sees the Department of Parks and Rec as an extension of the government that they already mistrust. In addition, many organizations who would otherwise make donations to the state parks don't want to pay for state park employees and administrative costs, which they feel is the state's responsibility, but they're very interested in funding other programs. Closing park also means loss of the educational functions of our parks, often another source of revenue generation as well. And this just accounts for the immediate loss of educational function. The permanent loss, I can't even begin to talk about today. Service reductions have led to loss of other possible funding sources. For example, grant funding, which is going unused as DPR is focusing its efforts on the closure and the cuts and doesn't have the funds or staff to do the environmental studies and other processes required to use these grant funds. So at our park currently we have 2 grants that are on hold, and we may lose the funding because there aren't the resources to do the studies and the environmental reports that are needed to be done before they actually use the grant funds. In addition, I think several people have talked about the unwanted visitors to state parks that increase with the staff reduction. In or under-patrolled state parks, it's become a haven for illegal behavior that otherwise might be controlled if the parks were open and both the law enforcement staff and the public were there. But there's also other unwanted visitors, rats and other varmints that are, create degradation to some of the resources. In our park, we've had sort of a unique solution to this. We have a part-time staff person who works there alone, and she actually brings her dog to work now for protection because there's no protection for her. They used to have several staff members working together in the area, and now they no longer do. So we've had to sort of figure out other ways to get around the lack of law enforcement. And we're in an urban area, so the funds that have been used to renovate and rehabilitate our parks are also being lost. And two things will come out of this lost. The funding sources that were donated to the projects initially will be less likely to fund in the future, feeling that their investments have been wasted. And then the cost of reopening these parks will require significant investment, bringing them back to their current status. So we're a historic park with an Adobe, and as Nina had referred to, Adobe's taken a lot of upkeep and constant. So the fact that we have a huge backlog of deferred maintenance, we're in danger of losing part of the Adobe. Lawsuits are another concern, either based on the failure to keep the park open or liability for injuries which have occurred on the property. And I think this cost is probably more staggering than we realize. At our park, we actually have litigation that the local city is threatening. We had 3 cities in the county that gave us nearly $3 million to renovate the Adobe after it was closed after the 2 major earthquakes in Los Angeles. And apparently, if the park is closed, part of the stipulation of the funding was that it stay open, and if the park closes, then those funds have to be paid back. So that's coming out of that, in addition to the $22 million that. The cost of closing parks does not just impact the parks themselves, though. Study after study, as we have heard today, has shown the incredible economic impact they have on the local community. Decreased visitation means decreased spending in local communities, which has led to the closure of local businesses. And the economic loss on non-park entities surrounding the park is a tragic part of the domino effect that we are seeing. One final area I would like to mention is the impact on nonprofits, which have long supported educational and interpretive programs at our state parks. These changing times have led to a shift in our mission and use of our funds to keep parks open rather than focusing on the programming within the park. So our funds are being diverted to more fundamental costs such as utilities and state park staff. And funding in the nonprofit world is also on the decline. One other element that many people might not think about is our board members, who are often doing a lot of the work now that because of decreased staff, are also being impacted because their own employment is asking more of them and giving them less leeway. The whole economic current, I think, is impacting us in some really detrimental ways. And so I think we're all being squeezed and being asked to do more. In addition, our organizations will be inheriting the incredible deferred maintenance cost of our parks if we take over operations of the park, which in many cases we're looking at doing. We're really dedicated to saving our parks, but I think that the cost of deferred maintenance and some of these things are going to be needed to be repaired on our watch are going to be pretty astounding. So the cuts to state parks really has much of a deeper impact than the $22 million that we hear about. And the domino effect that we see continues to spiral out of control as we move closer and closer to the closure of 25% of our state parks. Ironically, it's the very cuts and limited resources that prevent us from really understanding how much we are really losing here. And perhaps someday we'll truly understand the overall impact of these actions, but for now our energy has to be focused on keeping our state parks open. And we're currently more of a triage mode than an operational mode, and I think that's really important to remember. I wanted to give one final update, which is sort of off my notes here, on the state park closures and what CALPA has been doing. We decided to put signs at the parks to let people know that the parks were closing. In my last testimony, I think I spoke about the emergency broadcast system syndrome. People out there don't realize that their parks are closing, ironically. And so I spent since Thursday logging 1,500 miles on my car, driving from park to park and delivering signs to let people know that their local park is closing. And the whole point of this is to get them to take action, to work with their local communities and whatever the efforts are, so the signs have a place for the local organizations that are trying to save their park, to get in contact with them. And we're hoping, we have a few millionaires that drive by and want to make a donation. But it was amazing. It was very heartwarming, the support we got from the state park staff and the local volunteers and nonprofits. But it was really amazing to me how many people didn't realize their local park was closing. We heard, they can't be closing this park, not my park. It was really amazing that people still don't have the message. So we're really hoping that they get the message and maybe we get more people stepping forward to help.
Thank you for that. Thank you for our entire panel. We've got a lot to think about from this look into some of the costs of park closures. The only thing worse than closing all these parks, taking that terrible, unprecedented step, would be doing it and then realizing that we actually paid money rather than saved the advertised money. So we need to ask these hard questions, and we need to start getting some answers. So thank you all very much. We are done with the formal part of this hearing. Thanks again to everyone who participated, to my staff, and to Assemblymember Dickinson's staff. We're going to move to a very abbreviated public comment period. To the extent that folks have hung around, I want to give them a chance to articulate. I know this is going to sound terrible, but I'd like you to try to do this in 30 seconds or so. Tell us who you are, where you're from, and what you want us to know as quickly as possible. Thank you. We're going to start with Elisa Stansel, actually, from Jack London State Park. She gets the first spot because, unfortunately, fortunately, she accommodated our schedule and moved off a panel. But we appreciate you being here, Elisa.
Hi there. Can you hear me? No.
Let's.
Here we go. I will quickly say that I am very excited about the opportunity to be one of the nonprofits that are cobbling together a fabulous plan to save a park. The idea of saving a park or protecting a park and making a self-sustaining solution is sort of an entrepreneurial opportunity for us. And our nonprofit is coming together after 34 years of working with our park, with 3 state parks, to make this solution. And this weird extended timeline that from May of this year through July has actually served our purposes because there's so much to learn and so little information being able to be disseminated by the parks themselves. So I want to thank you for this opportunity of AB 42, and I want to say that this is a time of a sea change. This is a time for communities to create community solutions and for self-sustaining parks and to reach out and understand the value and communicate that value to those who could be served or are being served and make it happen.
Thank you. Well, you're certainly showing us how one community can step up in a big way, so thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Jared.
We're next going to ask folks to get ready. We'll have Michelle Luna, Greg Hayes, and Kathy Dargle, if I'm reading that correctly. And again, apologies for the schedule. We'll ask you to take about 30 seconds. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not going to say too much. I just want to thank you all for having this hearing today. I'm Michelle Luna from Stewards of the Coast and Redwoods. We are in the Russian River region, another one of those rural communities that is going to be impacted by economic impacts. We also are working on a plan. Thankfully, AB 42 was signed by the governor. We will be working on a plan, not just for a closed park, Austin Creek, but also for Sonoma Coast State Park, because there are significant service reductions in that park as well. We also are looking at creative solutions, so we are hopeful. We're getting support at the local level, I'm happy to say, and we're hopeful that when we take these new creative solutions to Sacramento, that they will be well received and they will work with us in ironing out the problems with them so that we can be successful in keeping our parks open.
Thanks for doing it. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much.
Greg Hayes.
Thank you. I'm Greg Hayes, president of the Valley of the Moon Natural History Association. I'm also the retired 30-year ranger that Sheriff Freitas mentioned, who wrote him asking for help. So the reason I didn't write sooner was I think I knew the answer in advance. Jack London State Historic Park is a park I worked at for 25 years. I now volunteer there, and along with Elisa Stansel, who you've heard address you, and several other people were putting together a proposal to actually protect, save, operate Jack London State Park, and also participate in substantially helping two other parks in the Sonoma Valley, Sugarloaf Ridge State Park and Annandale State Park, somehow weather this storm. So
Thank you for that. We want to make sure Call of the Wild is not describing how we're maintaining the park. Yeah. Kathy Dargle.
Kathy Daigle with the
Daigle,
California
sorry about
State
that.
Railroad Museum Foundation, and we support the Railroad Museum here and Railtown 1897 in Jamestown. And we've contributed through the years well over $50 million to help state parks. And in the recent years, we've contributed almost $2 million up at Railtown. What I'm here to say is we are ready to step up. Unfortunately, in our case, we've asked, and so far we haven't been invited to one meeting yet or been involved in the negotiations or discussions on saving Railtown. So we're here once again to say we're ready to help. Thanks.
Well, thank you for that. I'm sure your assembly member here is ready to help make that happen. Caroline Cathy, Christina Strawbridge, and Gal Henry. Gay Henry. We get those folks here.
Hi, good try. Carolyn Cathy.
Thanks, Carolyn.
With Mendocino Area Parks Association, Mendocino County, where 8 parks are being closed.
Yeah.
But we do appreciate the challenges that you have, and we don't want to sit here and make judgment when we're not in that position. So what we want to do, though, is step in and try to figure out how we can help and how on a local level that we can make a difference. And so to explain briefly, we are in communication with Standish Hickey, who the fire department has contacted us to see what we can do to work with them. The Westport Land Trust is, I think, trying to put together something for Westport. The Point Cabrillo Lightkeepers Association is trying to put something together for them. MAPPA itself, are trying to put something together for Russian Gulch and Hendy Woods and the Greenwood Museum. So on a local level, because we love these parks, just all of us here love these parks, and so that's why we're here. And I believe that if we come together, that we can do this, and we appreciate you. We want to know how you can support us, though, and if there's some way that you can keep a lot of the hindrance and barriers from making it impossible, or to make it impossible that we do this. Mm-hmm. And I know two of the really big issues we've discussed is liability insurance, and the other is security. So we've got a lot of discussion going on in our county about that. So if you could help us with some of these issues, but we appreciate it. Together we can do it. Thanks.
Thank you for that spirit. Absolutely. Gay Henry, and then Maggie Rufo and Mac Farrell.
Hello, my name is Gay Henry, and I'm a member of the Anderson Marsh Interpretive Association. We are in Lake County at the southeast part of Clear Lake. And I want to tell you what I told some of my students many years ago. You guys are doing a great job of looking awake, because I know you're tired. It's been long, so I really appreciate that. And I want to tell you that my husband and I got up at 4:45 this morning to drive for 2 hours here, so we could be here. And I want to share with you.
So you're also doing a great job.
Thank you. Yeah, really. I'm wearing a copy of a petroglyph that's found in our park. Anderson Marsh State Historic Park has some of the probably the most Native American artifacts of any park in our state. So we're a little concerned about how this is going to be protected if it indeed might close. And right now our association is working very hard with our district superintendent to make sure that at least until July 1st, we're going to stay open. Our association is picking up some costs, and we're continuing to do our field trips, and we just had, a bunch of kids from Ukiah visit, so we're fairly hopeful. Fortunately, I guess the state hasn't been spending that much money on us for years, so we don't have to come up with a lot right now.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maggie Rufo.
Hi, my name's Maggie Rufo, and
it's easy to understand why rural representatives are concerned about this issue. I'm going to be joining a chorus of others here today, I'm sure, with identifying some funding alternatives for preventing state park closures. I'll lend my voice to that. Find the savings elsewhere. California state parks already have a positive return on investment. You're losing money by closing state parks. Reduce state park operating costs through partnerships, and we've certainly talked about that, so I won't, but I would mention national parks and recreation districts in particular. Bring in more revenue. Using the model that the National Park Service has done, where the private sector funds and builds more profit-making facilities in California state parks. Asilomar is the classic example in our system. Model funding after the CalTour or CTTC approach, which is partnerships with private industry to generate additional